If you've watched The History Guy for any period of time, you know that I collect hats. I've been doing it for a long time. I can't completely explain why, but they are a part of history. If you can see a hat in a photograph, you can make a pretty good guess about when that photograph was taken. Except for some hats, which stayed in style for such a long time that you just can't tell, including one that you might have thought had gone out of style, but it's still a larger part of culture than you might realize. And if you're watching this video on January 15th, the day that it was released, it just might be this hat's birthday. Allegedly. The story goes that Mr. John Hetherington, one of London's haberdashers, wore a silk hat described as a tall structure having a shiny luster and calculated to frighten timid people on the streets of London, January 15th, 1797. People were so entranced by the sight that began to follow Hetherington until the street was crowded with a howling mob. An account explains that Hetherington was arraigned before the Lord Mayor on a charge of breaching the peace and inciting a riot. The high headwear was so horrifying that the officers of the Crown stated that several women fainted at the unusual sight, while children screamed, dogs yelped, and the young son of Cordwainer Thomas, who was returning from a chandler's shop, was thrown down by the crowd that was collected and had his right arm broken. In his defense, Hetherington argued that he had not violated any law of the kingdom, but was merely exercising a right to appear in a headdress of his own making. I think we can agree that that is perhaps the most epic story of introducing a hat ever. Nobody, to my knowledge, fainted at the first sight of a fez or a beret. It is also, almost certainly, fake. The story first appeared in the London Evening News in 1897. Extensive research has failed to find either a haberdasher named John Hetherington nor a news story mentioning him prior to a century after the event was supposed to have happened. Even more damning, a firm called Dunnage and Larkin had patented the silk hat in 1794, 3 years ahead of the supposed riot. You can still find the Hetherington riot story repeated in various places on the web, but the website The Man in the Hat notes it is an early example of fake news, propagated by lazy editors who couldn't be bothered to check their facts. In fact, the hat likely came to England from France, where paintings by French artist Charles Vernet in the 1790s showed the hats being worn by les incroyables, or the Incredibles, a subculture of aristocratic French dandies that thrived during the period called the Directorate, the First French Republic. If French dandies are less fun than screaming children and barking dogs, note that while the hat may not have originally caused women to faint, the top hat was thought to be a major cause of erethism, or mercury poisoning, that was a common ailment of 19th century hatters, who used mercuric nitrate to stiffen the felt in hats, thus leading to the term mad as a hatter, and explaining why perhaps the most famous Mad Hatter, the Hatter in Lewis Carroll's 1865 classic Alice in Wonderland, is often illustrated wearing a top hat, although the character's hat is never actually described in Carroll's book. So in the disputed history of the top hat, you may, so to speak, choose your own poison, a French dandy, a riot, or a Mad Hatter. In any case, the style began to gain popularity at the end of the 18th century, when it was usually called a silk hat. The name top hat didn't come into style until late in the 19th century. And if you didn't realize that it was that old, it is the hat that commonly replaced the tricorns and bicorns of the 18th century. The popularity of the hat showed notably when British Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel created the London Municipal Police in 1829. Their first uniform included a top hat. The National Emergency Services Museum in Sheffield noted, when the Metropolitan Police was founded in 1829, there was a huge amount of suspicion from the general public about the new force patrolling their streets. To counter the public's distrust, the force's uniforms were designed to look deliberately civilian rather than military. They featured a blue tailcoat, albeit one with a high collar to prevent garroting, white or blue trousers, and the tall stovepipe hat that was popular among upper-class men at the time. In addition to giving the impression that these peelers, as they were called, were gentlemen, the hats were reinforced enough to protect the officer from a blow, and even so much so that an officer could stand on top of his hat to see over a fence. However, the tall hat had its drawbacks, as the museum notes. In time, though, the stovepipe hat proved to be impractical. Chasing down criminals was made much harder for a constable if he had to run wearing his hat. They were so warm in summer that ventilation holes had to be cut into the top to keep officers cool. The top hats would eventually be replaced by the iconic custodian helmet. And the hats weren't just used by police. In the 19th century, they were commonly worn by volunteer firemen, usually in a stiffened shellac version that was both stylish and practical. That then became part of the fashion of the famous New York Bowery Street Boys, a New York street gang that largely consisted of working-class men who were members of the volunteer fire department. The top hat fit their exaggerated sense of style. Historian Tyler Anbender explained in his 2001 book 5 Points. A black silk hat, smoothly brushed, sitting precisely upon the top of his head. He has a particular swing, not exactly a swagger to his walk, but a swing which nobody but a Bowery boy can imitate. While often portrayed as violent, the Bowery Boys are actually simply a subculture of a class with rising wealth. British traveler George Foster wrote in 1850, "Who are the boys and gals of New York? Sometimes a stout clerk in a jobbing house, oftener a junior partner at a wholesale grocery, still more frequently a respectable young butcher with big arms and broad shoulders, in a blue coat with a silk hat and a crape wound about its base, and who is known familiarly as Bowery Boy." The hat not only represented style, but class and distinction and, well, height. For example, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, one of the most prolific and renowned engineers of his time, was frequently seen in his tall stovepipe hat. The engineer who built the Great Western Railway, the first purpose built transatlantic steamship, the Great Western, London's Paddington Station, and much more. According to Brunel's SS Great Britain Museum, it is very probable that Brunel wanted to project a certain image in order to be viewed as a successful engineer, and the stovepipe hat, popular at the time, certainly helped him to do that. And of course, it is now indelibly linked with his image as the foremost engineer of the Victorian period. But the hat also offered another advantage to the great engineer. Standing just over 5 feet tall, his trademark 8-inch stovepipe hat would have gone some way in making him look more imposing to his clients and contractors. The British Institution of Civil Engineers explains Brunel was known for being visibly self conscious about his height, and would often wear very tall top hats to increase his height. The situation was different for a famous man across the pond. Stephen Carter wrote in Smithsonian Magazine in 2013. Abraham Lincoln was our tallest president, and 6'4" he would stand out even today, and he certainly towered over the men and women of his era. The top hat he habitually wore in public made him taller still. You couldn't miss him in a crowd. The 16th president wore the top hat in war and peace, on the stump and in Washington, on occasions formal and informal. He wore it the night that he was assassinated. Why did he choose the top hat? Perhaps it simply was the style for a man of his era. Author Debbie Henderson wrote in her 2000 book, The Top Hat, An Illustrated History, it had become the irrepressible symbol of prestige and authority. And the National Emergency Services Museum writes that even as late as 1897, one newspaper reported that other men may or may not wear the tall hat. But the man who has the quality of gentle manners and conforms to the custom of his class seldom fails to wear it, in the specified hours and places. No man can be morally loose with the tall hat set squarely upon his head. But Carter wonders, nowadays we have trouble envisioning Lincoln without his top hat, but how he began wearing it remains unclear. Carter speculates that Lincoln may have started wearing the hat as a gimmick, especially since he was known for wearing a rather worn one. An affectation, Carter writes, perhaps intended to suit his frontier image. While the purpose may have been to help Lincoln stand out in a crowd, that could be a problem. On one occasion, an assassin apparently identified him, writing, by his hat, and he shot Lincoln's stovepipe off his head. And while observing the 1864 Battle of Fort Stevens, Lincoln had to be warned to get down, as his hat made him too obvious to the Confederates. The iconic look stayed with the president to the end. Carter notes, on the night Lincoln died, he dressed for the theater in a silk top hat, size 7 1/8, from the Washington hatmaker J.Y. Davis. When Lincoln was shot, the hat was on the floor beside his chair. But the hat represented more than the president, and came to represent America itself via its allegorical embodiment, Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam's history is complex. At the end of the 18th century, he represented not the nation, but the U.S. government. A popular, although disputed, story is that he was based on a meat packer named Samuel Wilson, who provided rations during the War of 1812, labeled SWUS, which some soldiers claim meant Sam Wilson, Uncle Sam. Some cartoons of the 19th century depicted Uncle Sam, characteristic goatee, wearing a top hat, particularly those by Thomas Nast, who also created the iconic image of Santa Claus. But Uncle Sam still had many looks until his appearance was standardized with the famous World War I recruitment poster created by artist James Montgomery Flagg in 1917. Exactly why is he wearing a top hat? Perhaps because of the previously mentioned connection to moral standing, or maybe, as with Lincoln, simply to stand out in a crowd. But the top hat, a standard of formal wear, didn't just represent America, obviously. The hat was common in diplomacy, worn by leaders the world around, by king and emperors, prime ministers and presidents, even chancellors. In 2019, the Times of Israel notes Hitler's top hat sold for more than $55,000 at a controversial auction of Nazi memorabilia in Germany. The top has become an indelible part of culture, perhaps most embodied by the eponymous 1935 Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers movie, Top Hat, but also in an iconic androgynous look by Marlene Dietrich's character in the 1930 film Morocco, and a common prop for the voiceless Harpo Marx. A 1920 drawing by illustrator Ray Irving of a character that would come to be known as Eustace Tilley would become forever linked to the magazine The New Yorker, while the association with wealth and the upper class helped to create the image of Scrooge McDuck, the world's richest duck, and the very symbol of wealth acquisition, rich Uncle Milburn Pennybags, mascot of the board game Monopoly. A red and white version is the Hat in Dr. Seuss's The Cat in the Hat, and Guns N' Roses guitarist Slash is famous for his top hat, saying in an interview in 2010, "You can pull it down, pull your hair down over your face, and just sort of hide behind that." The hat has also entered popular culture because of its connections to magicians, where it has not only become a part of the symbolic costume of the magician, but the common place from which a rabbit is removed. The cartoon character Bullwinkle is often depicted attempting to pull a rabbit out of a hat, only to pull out a dangerous animal and exclaim, "Wrong hat." A top hat with some magic left also animated Frosty the Snowman. But one legend needs to be put to rest. There's a common misconception that the fashion of wearing of men's hats in the U.S. was killed by President John F. Kennedy when the young and cool new chief executive showed up without a hat to his 1961 inauguration, a break with tradition that put an end to haberdashery in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Fact-checking site Snopes buries that legend with a simple fact. JFK, in fact, wore a top hat all day to his 1961 inauguration, as did outgoing President Eisenhower. While Kennedy did deliver his speech hatless, his top hat was in the chair behind him. A more likely driver was driving, as tall hats were simply impractical in automobiles. Top hats might not be worn as commonly as they once were, but they're still worn at formal weddings. They're the men's hat of choice at the Kentucky Derby and the Royal Ascot. And while a hat is not necessarily required for black tie formal, a top hat is generally considered essential for the more formal white tie formal. This beautiful vintage top hat made by the Cavanaugh Company of New York is of a special kind. Patented in 1812, the opera hat fits under your seat at the theater. Functionality and style. The hallmarks of a great hat. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.